Okay, hey class, welcome back. This is going to be our third video in our Unit 4 of Molecular Structure. Today we're going to talk about chemical bonding. So, if I'm rolling out an objective for this video or this section is, I want us to be able to understand why chemicals bond together and what is a chemical bond. So in saying that, let's dive into where we're going today. So, we've talked about intra and intermolecular forces. So let's take a closer look at intramolecular forces. These are forces that hold one atom to another atom, or make molecules, or even hold an atom together itself. So if I have a solution of hydrochloric acid, the forces holding the hydrogen to the chlorine to make our hydrochloric acid is the intramolecular forces. But in a solution of hydrochloric acid, we're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, if not more than that, of hydrochloric acid molecules. And those molecules are going to interact with each other. The HCl molecules themselves are going to be repulsive and attracted to each other in different ways. Those forces of attraction and repulsion, that's going to be considered intermolecular forces. In other words, intramolecular forces are forces that hold atoms to each other. These are the forces that make our chemical bonds. Chemical bonds are considered attractions between the nuclei and valence electrons of different atoms that bind atoms together. So in other words, it's saying, hey, the valence electron of one atom is attracted to the nuclei or the overall of another atom. Okay? So, with that understanding chemical bond, let's talk about how do chemical bonds occur. When an atom bonds to another, their valence electrons are redistributed in a way that makes that atom more stable. The way the valence electrons are distributed will determine the type of bond that occurs. For most cases, they will either be taken or shared. So the electrons will either be fully taken from one atom to another atom, or they will partially share the electrons for part of the time. Okay, we'll get more into that in a bit. As stated in prior units, the electrons that are influenced and responsible for these types of interactions are valence electrons, or the outermost electrons. If we look back at our octet rule, we see that atoms want to have a full, halfway filled, or even empty valence shell. That means they want 0 valence electrons, 4 valence electrons, or 8 valence electrons. This is the one driving factor which causes chemical bonding. For instance, if an atom has 1 valence electron and another atom has 7 valence electrons, it would be easier for that element with 1 valence electron just to give up its valence electron to the one that has 7, so that both of them can fulfill their octet. The one that had 7, it gained 1, so it has a full valence shell of 8, and the one that had 1, that gave it away, and now has an empty valence shell. So both of them are happy because they fulfilled their octet rule. By distributing valence electrons, both of these elements are in their most stable form. So that's what we're going back to with the octet, like they're trying to stabilize out. So chemical bonds are interactions between the valence electrons of one element and another element's nuclei, the attractive forces. If it's going to take an electron or if it's going to give up an electron depends on our octet rule. Remember, they want to be fully filled, halfway filled, or empty. So 4 valence electrons, 8 valence electrons for a fully filled, or 0 valence electrons for an empty. Okay, so now we can talk about the types of chemical bonds and their strengths. There are 3 types of chemical bonds. There's ionic, metallic, and covalent. In the simplest form, we'll go more in depth in a future video. Ionic compounds are compounds between metals and nonmetals. So you have a metal and nonmetal come together to form an ionic compound. Covalent compounds are formed from 2 nonmetals coming together. Okay, there's no metal in this. They're just 2 nonmetals coming together to make a covalent compound. And then, our metallic bonds happen when metals bond to metals. Okay, so if we're going to look at these bonds, we got to understand also their strength. If we're going to from strongest to weakest, the strongest bond is going to be your ionic bond, and your weakest bond is going to be your metallic bond. So that means your covalent is in the middle as your intermediate one. Just to review you on metals, nonmetals, and metalloids, let's talk really quick about them. Metals make up the majority of the periodic table. Metals have a tendency to lose electrons during chemical reactions and make cations. They're primarily found on the left side of the periodic table and include the transition metals. Metals are characterized by having luster, so in other words, they're shiny. They can conduct electricity well, and they are malleable and ductile. So that means they can be hammered into a sheet or pulled into a wire. So that's metals. That's most of your periodic table. The nonmetals are on the right side of your periodic table, and they have a tendency to gain electrons in a chemical reaction. This would mean that these elements would have a tendency to become more negative overall and become anions. Nonmetals are characterized by lack of luster, otherwise they're dusty and not very shiny looking. They're not malleable, and they're also very poor conductors of electricity. These are going to be like a lot of powdery looking substances. Like if you got sulfur, just pure sulfur, that's going to look more like a green-yellow powder. Okay. Now finally, metalloids. Metalloids have the properties of both metals and nonmetals. They're kind of like the hybrid together. Metalloids are useful semiconductors, and they are the transition group between metals and nonmetals. They're the ones who split that down. They're the ones that we're just going to have to memorize which ones they are. And they basically are the barrier between the metals and nonmetals. In saying that, I don't want to get too much into like ionic, covalent, and all that bonds. That's going to be another video. In this video, I just want to emphasize that how chemical bonds occur. So chemical bonds occur when electrons are given up or taken or shared. And the types of chemical bonds: ionic, covalent, metallic. Hope this helped you out, and keep up the good work in your class.